He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with over 27 years of experience. Together, he and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back with another episode, Henry. And as we kind of like to do, we're breaking new ground this time with 2 young guests who are just graduated students of London's School of Communication Arts. We know about the SCA because the dean, Marc Lewis, is a friend of ours. He's been on our show for, I think, twice with some great conversations. And we sort of suggested this idea of inviting current or former students to come and talk to us about their experiences. Let's meet them now and enjoy the conversation. Henry, we are back with another episode. Today, we're doing something for the first time. We've had many conversations, at least 2 that I can recall, with Marc Lewis, who's the dean of the School of Communication Arts in London. And on a recent conversation followed up by email, we said, wouldn't it be great if we could talk to a couple of your students, either current or recently graduated, to get a sense of where they are, what their interests, how they got into advertising, what they'd like to do. And then we added on to that by saying, we're going to throw them a little loop and throw them a little challenge. We'll do one of our reverse engineering exercises, which Henry and I have started to do in the few recent episodes, just to keep them on their toes. And so today we are joined by Jess Saunders and Kerr. They are both recently graduated, I believe in July, from SCA, the School of Communication Arts.
Congratulations.
Yes, congratulations. So Ro and Jess, welcome to the Brief Brothers.
Thanks for having us.
We're really excited. We've got some things we want to do, but before we do all of that, let's find out who you are. So I'd like to have each of you tell us about what got you attracted to the industry. How did you find the School of Communication Arts? What was your experience like at Communications SCA? What's going on in your world now? What challenges are you facing as you are entering the world of work? Ro, why don't we start with you?
Well, how did I start? So I guess I was working in the industry in fashion and music as a hairstylist at first on music videos and that kind of thing, beauty. And then I started a creative direction company with a friend of mine, and we started to do like creative direct music videos and press shoots and that sort of thing. And then I just felt like I wanted to push out from just fashion and music, and I wanted to take creativity on a bigger scale and work with bigger clients and do bigger things. And I was looking up what that would be. I didn't really know. I didn't know advertising was an industry. It didn't occur to me, oh yeah, ads you see on TV get made by someone. And when I was Googling art direction courses for advertising, SCA came up, and I saw that it had some of the best names went there, and also how closely interconnected they are with the industry and the briefs they get. And I think all of that really excited me. And then I had an interview, and Marc was lovely, and I got it.
Okay, so no, you've recently graduated, and as I understand it, you and Jess have been partners for how long? You've been like an art director, copywriter partners. Was that a recent connection? And you're looking for work as partners? Talk about that.
Yeah, so that...
You're next, Jess.
No, you go.
Sorry. Oh, wait.
Oh, no, oh, right. So it's me. Yeah. So we partnered, I think, March, just after D&AD. We officially came together. So we had worked together before that for a little while, because
Okay.
at SCA...
Just to be clear, D&AD, the directors, designers, and art directors. Is that an annual show? That's the annual show?
Yes. And so we do at SCA, they make you enter into the new blood for all the budding creatives. And it's a part of the curriculum there. So we worked together with different partners for D&AD, and then we came back together again and decided to make it permanent. and so we are looking for placements and internships together, hopefully to take over the world.
Yeah. Before we hit the record button, I was telling Jess that, I wish I had started that way. I went up solo, and it may have made it more difficult for me to get started, but so I think you're on the right track. So Jess, your turn. Tell us a little bit about you. How did you get into the industry? What captured your imagination?
So I think I always wanted to be a writer, but I kind of accepted that it might never happen. And then I kind of fell into languages, ended up studying French and Spanish at uni, and then became a translator. And actually, while I was studying for my translation masters, I remember I really got into Mad Men. And like Ro, before then, I'd never even thought of advertising as a career. But as soon as I started watching that, I was hooked, and I thought, that looks like an amazing career. Fast forward a couple of years, I'd been a translator and I really was not enjoying it. So I ended up investigating advertising, and fell upon SCA, and it becomes clear pretty quickly that is the school to go to if you want to get into advertising, because of just the contacts you'll get, sets you up for life in 1 year. It's like doing a uni course, 3 years crammed into one, really. Super intense. But I decided to go for it, even though I'm quite shy, and it seemed like it was very much like somewhere where you perform and there's lots of outgoing people. But luckily, like Marc makes it very clear that it's a school for everyone, introverts and extroverts. And I ended up getting in, and yeah, the rest is history.
Well, Marc, of course, is shy and retiring.
Yeah, of course.
And as I was
when I met him.
as I was commenting before we hit the record button, he can do things with his facial hair that I can only dream of. It's amazing, right? Yeah, he is quite a character. And one of the things that Henry and I have talked about before we actually had our first conversation with Marc was the lack of training in our industry. It used to be a big thing taken over by the major ad agencies. The legacy shops used to have their own internal schools and would train copywriters and art directors and account direct management, as well as later on planning. And that just went away with the change in how agencies were compensated, to be picked up, well, at first by really nothing, but then eventually colleges and universities, and then these separate programs, these portfolio schools like the Miami Ad School and like SCA. So what Marc is doing is essential. It's absolutely necessary. What's it been like for you in his classes? What did he challenge you to do? What were some of the instructors putting in front of you that made you find yourself more and more attracted to your decision to go into advertising?
Oh, I think a big thing with SCA is the live briefs you get given. So you get clients, agencies who will come in and give you a brief that they're trying to crack and let you have a go at it and then present your pitch to them, basically. So you're thrown straight into the deep end, having had no experience. Suddenly you're pitching to an agency for something that could actually go live. I think there's a big adrenaline rush that comes with that. And just getting to think outside the box, make something that you can really own out of nothing. Yeah,
I think it's similar for me. It's the connections that they encourage you to build with the industry. And like at SCA, I'm not sure about the other schools, but at SCA they give you talks and classes on how to send emails and how to approach people to try to get it's a big thing for you to create a relationship with the agencies before you leave SCA. And I think that those talks and those classes are actually just as valuable as the ones that taught you, the specific art direction skills, because they set you up with the communication part of learning communication. And I think, SCA was really good at that. And that made me, I know there were times when I was like, this is so hard. But knowing that I have a network of people who are all here to support me was really great.
Both of you mentioned this idea of, not really considering advertising even as an industry that exists prior to, deciding to join it. And that's something that rang a bell with me because I was asked to join an agency, and I like to say I had never contemplated what went on inside an ad agency before I set foot in one for day one of the job, 27 plus years ago. So I think that's the fascinating thing about that is how ubiquitous advertising is, right? Like it touches everyone, everyone sees it. The best advertising, right, gets into the popular culture and is part of the common language that we all speak. Like we're going to talk a little later about a classic, ad that somehow and to Jess, your point about like creating something from nothing. And if you're really, really lucky, it becomes something that people talk about for years and years to come and becomes a fabric of the popular culture. Yet, as an industry, it's almost invisible. Like the amount of people that work in the advertising industry in comparison to the influence of the industry is very small. The number of people. So I've always been fascinated by that. Like people, I'll call them civilians, don't have any clue what goes on in an ad agency.
Or they think they do, but really don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My favorite civilian commentary is like they think that we have like all of these magic levers that we pull to brainwash people to buy stuff. I'm like, if only it were true, I'd have a lot more money. And I mean, the truth is, we're like monkeys at the controls of a 747, just pulling levers left and right, and we don't know what's going to happen. And sometimes we land the plane, and sometimes we crash it into a mountain.
So true.
Well, I resonate with, Henry and I haven't talked about this a lot, but I too didn't. I was 30 years old when I landed my first ad agency job. I got my bachelor's degree. I had my first job out of college, which was in media relations. Then I went back to school and got a master's degree in English and creative writing, studied poetry and literary translation. So Jess, you were talking about translation. I'm guessing it wasn't literary. It was more diplomatic.
Yeah.
That's where you just mimic what someone has said. Literary translation, there's at least a bit of license involved. Poetry. And then I decided I needed to start paying back my student loans. I need a job. And I kind of backed my way into the industry. I think older people who start a little bit later, come to our game with a little bit of life experience, which isn't, and I'm guessing that, you guys aren't teenagers. So you've been out there doing a few things already as you have opened up to this thing that you didn't know about called advertising. So you have this advantage of having lived a few years. And I think that's gonna help you. So what would you say to those who are a few years younger than you, who are beginning this path that you started? What would your advice to them be?
It's hard because that hasn't been our experience. And I do think that having that little bit of life experience has benefited both of us, because we can bring something interesting to the table from our lives as ordinary people before we started to see everything through, an advertising person's perspective. It really does alter your brain permanently. Once you start to think about ads, you never see them the same way again. So yeah.
I think that's true of the good ones. Unfortunately, Howard and I lament the fact that a lot of our colleagues in the industry, when they check out of work at whatever time it is, they go back to, being consumers, oblivious to, like, I'm like the type of person, I'm always looking at ads and I'm wondering, what were they trying to say? What were they trying to do here? Why did they choose this cast? Like putting on my critique hat, and I think that's the sign of somebody who's really taken this on as a practitioner, as opposed to just a job. I like that you guys are in the UK, and of course it's like ground zero for like the best advertising in the world, has been for decades. And I like to say, look at their trade organization is the Institute for Practitioners of Advertising. In the US, we don't have that. I don't think nobody views themselves as practitioners.
The four A's, and it doesn't have anything to do with practice or an institute. It's the American Association of Advertising Agencies. It's just a group.
Yeah, and so I just think that I think that the best among us see it as a vocation, as a practice, as something that you don't just turn off when you leave, the office at the end of the day, or you turn off the computer.
Yeah, it's in everything. Advertising. I think Jess and I, we talk a lot about, sometimes we just have random ideas and we just got to shoot them over to each other. And actually, yeah, you do start to see every little thing in your house. You now start to think of a way to advertise.
Yeah.
How can I sell this?
When I do my workshops on brief writing, I throw the students a loop. I say students because, well, first of all, they're all younger than I am, but they're youngish, mid-level, sometimes senior level marketers and creatives. So they're not truly young people in the way you'd expect to see in school. But I try to throw them loops with exercises that show them everyday objects and say, okay, here's a chair. What's the single-minded proposition for the chair? It's like, what? I don't even know the brand. It's like, okay, you don't know the brand. Well, what can you deduce? And they have to work through that as a problem. So I'm really curious, as you were saying earlier, that you were thrown into the deep end by being handed a what you called a live brief, meaning a real brief. It's in process. This isn't last year's brief. This is right here, right now. How long did it take you to discern the difference between a good brief and a bad brief? And what do you, as working creatives, what can you tell us about your knowledge of what a good brief is?
Oh, that's a question. I think I'm still trying to figure out what's a brief and a bad brief. But briefs that give you little nuggets that you can take something from and run with. I like, because sometimes we get briefs where it just very plainly gives a fact, but no real feeling, no real thing that is being tried to, that someone wants to unearth. But when they give you a little nugget, something that you can pull apart, then I think that makes a good brief.
Brief writers, pay attention. Brief writers, pay attention to what Ro just said. Oh, that's good. What about you, Jess?
Oh, I think a good brief, you look at it and you know what they're asking for, and you can almost picture it. Maybe not quite, but you know that with time, you're going to be able to come up with something. If you sit staring at a brief and you're just baffled, sometimes there's a bit of a gut feeling involved, I think, as well. And especially if they're asking for multiple things, like they're pulling you in multiple directions, it becomes clear they don't really know what they want.
Wow. So in the course of your time at SCA, which is what, a year, 2 years? How long was the program?
1 year.
1 year. So you worked together since March. In the time that you worked together, how many, well, actually, before you were partners, you were seeing briefs before you were partners, correct?
Yeah.
So how many briefs would you say you'd actually had a chance to work on during your time at SCA?
Oh gosh, so many. We used to have ones that were given to us at 9 a.m. and we were expected to pitch at 4 p.m.
Okay.
Yeah, those are one day.
A lot of those.
Did you say more than 20? More than 20?
Definitely
Way
more than
more.
20.
So
Wow.
every week you get a brief, more or less. So that's, I don't even know how many weeks. If there were 30 weeks, we had at least 30 briefs for each week, more or less. And then some weeks there are 3 briefs at a time. But some of them are for 3 weeks and some of them are for 1 week. So probably about 30, more than 30
well,
briefs.
So you've had a chance to really scrutinize briefs, even though you only had a little time to work on them. And I like the whole business about the nuggets. If there's a nugget that you can work on, Henry likes to say, and I agree with him, and I teach this, we would aspire to writing a brief that is inspirational, But if we can't quite get to inspirational, the minimum standard, the bar has to be at least at clear, so that the
Yeah.
creatives know what they're supposed to be doing, right? Clarity is primary. Of
Yeah.
those, let's say 30 briefs, how many met that minimum standard of clarity?
Oh,
You don't
Not
have to name
many.
names. You don't have to name names.
But let's put it this
Correct.
way. We got trained early on to basically just rewrite all briefs.
Yes, yes. From day one.
Yeah.
Okay.
The
And was that
standards
something,
were
was that a class that Marc taught, or was there someone who came in and showed you how to rewrite or write a brief?
Uri, but I can't remember his last name exactly, but Uri, he's a strategy mentor at SCA, and also Pete, strategy mentors at SCA, and they, like, every week we had a class on rewrite the brief and write the brief and then write it again and then do a little bit of creative work. And if you feel like the creative work is taking you on a different way to your brief, then rewrite the brief again and just like keep going back into it to make sure that you're super clear on what it is that you are trying to say. Yeah, SCA is, and actually Marc then implemented a thing towards the end, which I think was the first in our year, which is you had every piece of work that you do, we had to show the mentors a brief now. So not just like write an SMP, but we had to like write out a brief and show it to mentors, just so that the ideas aren't all over the place. And it's very, you know what you're trying to say, they know what you're trying to say, you know who your audience is, you know what you want the audience to do when they see whatever it is you are trying to get, you've created. Yeah.
So I have a question on that, because that could potentially create a huge problem, right? Like if in an agency environment, you receive a brief, you rewrite it on your own, and you come back with work that adheres to that brief and not the brief that was given to you by someone who was empowered to give you that brief, and somehow there's a social contract there in that brief that was given to you. Do you guys see any potential conflict there, or am I just taking this too literally, and your rewriting of a brief is just your interpretation of that brief?
Yeah.
Give me a little bit more on that.
Would you do it in isolation, or would you work with the brief writer to so that the brief writer knows that you're doing this?
I guess
think
that's another question I had, which was, these briefs, are they coming like just via email? Somebody says, hey, here's a brief, or is there an actual somebody who's presenting these briefs to you?
Yeah, they were usually presented over Zoom or in person, and then we take them away, and separately we would rewrite them. And by rewriting, I do think we mean more the latter, in terms of it's our interpretation of what they want or need but haven't quite been able to express.
Did they
And
know you were
something
going
that-
to do this, Jess?
Yeah. And they would encourage it. Sorry, Jess.
No, that's fine. I've pretty much finished.
Yeah.
So
and
it was
they would
like
ask and encourage that.
it was like a collaboration in a sense. They presented this brief to you with the expectation that you were going to do this exercise.
Yes, yeah. And I think that their desire in coming to the school in the first place was always to see the biggest, widest range possible of ideas, loosely based on the brief that they provided, because they might see something that maybe it's not quite on brief, but that sparks something else that they can take away and use and mold into something that does meet their brief.
See, Henry does a kind of version of this, and help me out here if I get it wrong, Henry. You tell me, and you've said this many times in our conversations, that you never dump a brief on a creative department cold. You always take a draft of your brief to the creative director and start to get feedback and reactions to your early drafts. I'm wondering if, once you land a position, and I'm confident that you will, it's not if, it's when.
Thank you.
if you continue this practice, which I think is wonderful, I encourage this. I tell my students in my workshops, creatives have skin in the game. They should be part of the process. What you've described to me sounds a little bit like, oh, we've already got this brief. We've already briefed in our own creatives. We're just going to brief you in, and we still expect you to do this exercise. But what would your expectation be if you land, when you land this position tomorrow? It's going to happen tomorrow, and you get your first brief. Would you want to have this back and forth with the brief writer? Would that be kind of an expectation, even though you're a juniors? What do you think?
I would love to be given a brief that I can just create from, and that I can just run with and just start making things, and not. I would love to be given a great brief that gives me lots of ideas. And I can still do my own research, and I can still try to find new things to add to the idea, but not, I would love to not have to rewrite it.
What if you didn't like the brief?
Well, yes. If I didn't like the brief, then I might have to send a very polite email and ask if I could make
So
suggestions.
I'm gonna interject, and as someone who's been doing this for a couple of decades, and say, for me, it's really rewarding when I give a brief and maybe a couple days later a young creative reaches out to me and says, hey, I have a couple of questions, or I have this idea and it doesn't exactly fit within the brief. And I want to have that conversation, because there is what Jess mentioned is a very true thing, right? As a strategist, I can only know so much. Then once the brief is in the hands of the creatives, it's an organic process, and ideas are going to bubble up that I could have never anticipated. And just because the brief doesn't directly address that, or there wasn't a direct line from the brief to that idea, doesn't mean that the brief didn't somehow inspire it, or even if it didn't. I think that those conversations need to happen, and we need to recognize this isn't a linear process. This is a kind of an iterative, organic process in which sometimes the best ideas are tangents of where we thought we were going to go initially with an initial brief. So I would tell young creatives that first of all, me as a strategist, one of the first things I want to do when I join a new agency, like when I'm getting to know people, is that I want the creatives to feel comfortable with me. I want them to understand that I'm on their team, that I have their objectives, their goals, their hopes and dreams are my hopes and dreams. I'm there to facilitate for them. And therefore, when and if they have a question or a doubt, they should certainly knock on my door, because that door is always going to be opened for them. I just think that it works better that way, because there's no way that a strategist can fully anticipate, every possible creative direction, route, idea, tangential idea that'll come down the pike. So I think it's good in a way, the exercise of rewriting the brief and understanding that in the course of an academic program where an agency comes in, gives you a brief, and they're trying to do a pitch or something and they want to get it real quick, you may not have access to that person. But once you're in an employee situation, I think that it is important that you avail yourself. And if the strategist or the brief writer, because sometimes it's not a strategist, could be a account person or whatever, isn't making themselves available, you have to be insistent and keep knocking on that door.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that may or may not surprise you is that your practice work and what you were taught in the school is not uncommon with mid-level and senior level creatives. One of our guests was a gentleman named Cameron Day, who is the son of a guide Day, a half of Chiat Day, and he's written 2 books on, I guess it would be guidelines and advice for the creatives on how to manage their careers. And the first book was about the early, getting started. How do you manage your first job? The second book is now kind of your mid-career. His third book is coming out later this year, which is about, when you reach the senior positions. Status. Yeah. And one of the things that he does is he writes something he calls a mantra. He gets a brief, especially if he's a freelancer, because he doesn't have the intimate connection to the brand and the process that employee would have. He takes the brief and he rewrites it, and he calls it a mantra. Now, this is a guy who's been in the business for, 20, 30 years or more. and he still does this. You may know that I've started something called the Creative Brief Archive, where I'm collecting a repository of creative briefs, and he is starting to send me his mantras for some of the projects that he's worked on. So it's an entirely different beast from a traditional creative brief. So what you're doing and what Marc has been encouraging you and your fellow classmates to do, I think is brilliant. And it's something that a lot of the best creatives do as they continue. But you still haven't answered my question. Of the 30 or so briefs that you saw, how many would you say were really, really good? I'm not going to let you get out of this one.
Really, really good. Maybe
Were there any? Were there any that were just like they knocked your socks off, so to speak?
This is going to sound really bad, but one of the ones that was really good, I remember, was written by someone who had just been to one of Marc's masterclasses on brief writing. So that says a lot, I think.
An endorsement.
Yeah, exactly.
Can remember. What I can remember is the briefs not saying much, but what they said in the presentation gave a lot more. So I'm trying to remember if what they said was on the brief, because we always take notes when somebody's speaking. So I remember a lot of good nuggets in what they said, but then I can remember going back to the sheet and it's not on there. So
that's not.
So maybe
that's not uncommon.
No.
Yeah.
In fact, I asked the question when I do my workshops. I ask creatives, I say, think back on the last year and how many briefs that you worked on, whatever that number is. How many of those briefs did you find truly inspiring? 1 in 10, 3 in 10, 7 in 10? You know what the answer is? What do you think they tell me?
0.
It's few, maybe 1, but it's usually, and I worked in the business. I was a copywriter and a creative director in agencies for 26 years. I remember 1 brief. Now, that doesn't mean the other briefs were bad. It just means I have 1 that sticks out in my memory. It was for a Lexus project I worked on in the late 90s. So it's just a rare thing to get a truly inspiring brief. So what you're, don't feel bad that you couldn't you couldn't come up with a direct answer, because it's not uncommon.
And that's frankly why this podcast exists and Howard's workshops exist. Is there's a lot of people out there writing briefs. A lot of people end up in a position, and particularly Howard's students, a lot of them are on the client side, and they end up with the responsibility of having to write a brief. It's not a responsibility they necessarily volunteered for, and so they don't understand or maybe they do by the time they take Howard's workshop. But the point is, at the beginning, they don't understand how this brief, like being better at writing a brief, will make the creative output of the teams that they're responsible for better. And one of the things that I like to say is, brief writing is writing. And so you have to practice it. You have to study from people that do it well. You have to look at how other people do it. You have to eat, breathe, and sleep it. And, ideally, it goes from being a form that you fill out, which is kind of how these people see it at the beginning, to a valuable document that you're writing, a piece of literature that you're writing that is going to somehow be a step in this creative process that actually adds to the process rather than takes away from it.
Your sentiment, Ro, about I just want to take a great brief and run with it, I think is very common. As a former creative myself, that would be my preference. I just give me the opportunity to create. But one of the things that Henry taught me, because I didn't quite realize this, is that I was the kind of a guy who would get a brief and I'd start saying, why? And he made me realize that, Howard, you're more of a strategic creative than others. So there are creatives who are interested in and fascinated by the strategy behind, and there are others who just want to do the work. And they're both necessary. One isn't bad and one isn't good. It's just, these are the kind of the way things fall on the spectrum. Some just want to do the work and some start to push back.
So I'm going to say something out there for all creatives, young creatives out there. To have a little bit of empathy with a brief writer, right? So the brief writer is basically, imagine all of the information in the world coming into a funnel and getting distilled down to what is on the page on that brief. That brief writer has to be really choiceful, has to make there's things that are in that brief that he chose or she chose to put in that brief, and there's things that were specifically excluded from that brief. And so I guess the question becomes, like, creatives like Howard rightfully ask, well, why? Like, you start and I love that as a strategist, because then I can get into, well, I considered that, but I rejected it because of X, Y, and Z reason, or because this brand is a challenger brand, we don't want to do that X, Y, or because this brand is in a leadership position, we don't want to take the tactics of a challenger. Like, I want to have that conversation. That's telling me the creative is engaged with the process. But I do see that there are different types of creatives, and some creatives are the ones like Howard that push back on a brief, or at least want to know, why did you choose this instead of that? Or, I see a lot of advertisers are doing X, Y, and Z. Why don't we do that? And I'm all for that. But I think that's very few creatives actually that do that. Most of them take whatever they're given, don't ask too many questions, and just start to ideate on them, which is okay. I think that's a fair way, but I do think that, like, the creatives that go on to become creative leaders are more curious about, like, why were these marketing or business decisions made prior to me getting the brief. And I think that's the reason Howard ended up teaching workshops about briefs, was he was unsatisfied with the briefs that he was getting. He was asking questions why, and he wasn't getting satisfactory answers to those questions. So he said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And his mission, I think, has become to create a generation of better brief writers, which is an admirable mission.
Well, fortunately, I'm not the only one out there doing it. Henry does it as well when he's got some time, when he's invited to do it. And there are others out there doing what I'm doing. But it's fun. I enjoy, sharing what I've learned. Because
why don't we?
Do we transition to do our little exercise?
Yeah, I think it'd be a great fun time to do that now. And since you guys have a lot of practice in interpreting briefs, we thought we'd do this exercise. We have a lot of fun with it. Sometimes we use current ads. Sometimes we use classic ads, like we're gonna do today. Not always TV, but TV is good just because in 30 seconds you get like a full message and pictures and sound and music and all that. So TV is just an easy to do and to reproduce in a video, obviously. With that, I think we're gonna workshop a brief together for this classic ad. You want to introduce it, Howard?
Yeah, in fact, you may have to do some editing here because I just now remembered I had to call it up. This is a classic from 1970 or 1971 for Samsonite luggage. Before, I wanted to ask you, have you ever done a reverse engineering? Do you know what I mean when I say reverse engineering? We're going to look at this spot and you figure out the brief from in the best way you can. Have you ever done that? Is that something that Marc put you through?
We have done something similar. I remember in the beginning, often we'd think about what the SMP must have been.
Okay.
Maybe not the whole brief, but definitely the SMP.
Right. I think it's a great exercise just to keep your brain tuned up. Can you all see that? All see the screen?
Yes.
It's a little fuzzy right now. It says here that this is from 1971. I was pretty sure this came out in 1970, but in any case, it's old. So we're going to look at this spot, and then we're going to talk about what we think the elements of the brief are. Now, we don't have a template that we use, but we usually focus on, 4 or 5 questions. Why are they doing this advertising? Who are they talking to? I like to use the tension point of what did the audience think before they would see this commercial, and what do you think they would think after they saw it? What's the single-minded proposition? So that's 4 questions right there. We might have some other ones, but those I think are 4 key questions. So here we go.
Dear clumsy bellboys, brutal cab drivers, careless doormen, ruthless porters, savage baggage masters, and all butter-fingered luggage handlers all over the world. Have we got a suitcase for you?
Okay. So this spot is older than everybody on this podcast except me and Henry.
I was 2.
You were 2? Yeah, I was a little older. So I mean, Henry and I clearly have some thoughts on this, but why don't we let you 2 get started? What were your first thoughts? Did you get a chance to talk with each other, or did you just watch this separately?
We did.
Let's be honest. I'm gonna let the folks on our viewers know that we sent them a link in advance, so they had a chance to look at this. We didn't want to just pop them into this without any warning. So
Not much warning. It was yesterday. So
it was yesterday, right?
I was going to play along and pretend I'd just seen it for the first time, but okay. Have some really inspired thoughts about it. I've seen this before. Had you seen it before, Ro?
Oh, you're mute.
You're muted, or we've lost your audio.
Sorry. No,
yeah.
no, I actually have never seen this one before. No.
Okay.
I do really like it.
Yeah, it was great. I think I love the thing that I love about the old ads is how kooky they are, and and just how a little bit crazy they were. Like, somebody in the room said we should get a gorilla and he should like swing this suitcase out like crazy.
So
So, yeah.
one of the things that's helpful, especially with these classic ads, is, you have to have a little bit of empathy and go back and understand the time, right? Like, so at the time, pre-internet, TV was king. Everybody in most countries, in the United States where this ad, I believe, originated, there were 3 TV channels that everybody watched. So everybody was kind of on the same page, like from a pop culture. Things weren't as fragmented as they are now. There was a more unified pop culture. But then you could also start thinking about the category, and I'm not going to lead the witness here. I think that we could have that conversation as we talk about it, about the spot. But just one of the things here is to try to think about it not in terms of our modern sensibilities, but think about the people that this was created for, the viewers at the time and the consumers at the time, what was available to them and so forth. So I don't know if we want to talk about target audience or objective.
Well, I think a great place to start, you can look at the brief and follow it as a story and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I've often said, and Henry's often said, that sometimes you don't have to do things in order. But for the sake of this discussion, I think it's a great place to start by asking the question, why are they doing this? What was the communication objective? Meaning, why are we advertising? Now, I don't expect you to know which luggage manufacturer had the largest market share at that time. Quite frankly, I don't know the answer to that either. But I think we can say safely, without giving anything away, that Samsonite was a pretty well-known name.
I think we were what we talked about was the idea that, especially at that time, Kerr and luggage and kind of it's obviously talking to an audience who is worried or cares about how their luggage is being handled and the quality of stuff that's in it, but also the quality of the actual suitcase itself, because that's pretty much what they're trying. Well, that's what I think they're trying to highlight here. It's how durable this suitcase is, and how it can withstand any kind of whoever comes across it, because nobody cares about your suitcase the way you care about your suitcase. Nobody knows what's inside it the way that you know what's inside it, and it doesn't. Yeah, and so people take it and they chuck it onto something, or they throw it down a hall, and you're thinking to yourself, my God. So that felt like the truth, the human truth that they had found and what they riffed off of.
That's super interesting, despite the
Yeah.
fact that Howard said we should go in order. I think you just kind of talked about, no, it's fine. I think it's
Yeah.
great. That's the point of this being an organic thing. Was I was thinking about myself about the commercial, and to me it's like, that's a huge insight, right? Nobody takes care of your stuff the way you do. And so this commercial is kind of built on that. It's like, you can't trust people to take care of your stuff the way you do. Therefore, you need to have luggage, in this case, that's very durable. But getting back to the objective, I think it was, and in my mind, what you're describing is something like, it would be written something like, demonstrate the durability of Samsonite luggage.
The exact word that's the exact word I picked. And I don't know if they were consciously asking for a product demonstration, because that's what this is, you know, or not. I don't know that, but that's what they got. For the, you know, it is the most unusual, and it's a memorable product demonstration, and the best ones are. I mean, Apple, just for example, has an amazing track record of doing product demonstrations. I'm wearing the AirPod right now. Whoops, and I just turned the spot back on without realizing it. and the first AirPod spot I ever saw was this cool guy listening to music, and all of a sudden he's climbing up the walls, and he's walking on the ceiling, and his AirPods are not falling out. Whether that was intended to show that they will stay in your ears or not, which I think it was, that was the effect. So
Yeah.
I like to teach my students to pick the right verb when they write their objective, and to demonstrate might have been a really good verb to communicate what you two could do with the brief.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not just a demonstration of the everyday. I love how it's just taken to its logical extreme. It's like all those little moments throughout your travels where someone's treating your suitcase poorly. Let's just combine them into one massive moment where a gorilla just throws it all over the place, because that's the same amount of force it's being treated with.
Dramatize is another verb that could have been there, right? Like, so let's dramatize the durability of our luggage.
With a little asterisk that said, please don't put your perfume inside this, but you know, that's...
Yeah, I did wonder about that.
So what? Yeah. For me, one of the areas that I started thinking about was the target audience. What do you guys have any thoughts on, like, who are they targeting here?
So Jess had some.
We started with obviously people who travel, but also it's got to be people who are familiar with the abuse that their luggage goes through as they travel. And actually, I think there were some clues in the script as well about the kind of travel that you might be doing. So you're staying in a fancy-ish hotel as a bellboy looking after your stuff. You're getting in a cab. You're not taking public transport. All these little things add up to maybe fancier travel, maybe even business travel. Yeah, those are.
And that's why
there's no bellboys at Motel 6, right?
Yeah.
But have some kind of money.
And that's why, because it's one thing, you know, and target audience, I think, is a place where brief writers a lot of times fall down. And Howard and I have had a lot of conversations about this. You know, they put a bullet pointer. It's obvious, yes, it's travelers, but that's where I think, like, starting to get empathetic about the target audience really pays off, because I started thinking about, okay, put ourselves in 1970, 71. We're 25 years after the end of World War II. The baby boomer generation is starting to graduate college, they're out there as professionals, they have a little bit of money. These are like young professional people that have disposable income to travel, they're educated. This is a period of time where there's no Amazon. Like nowadays, you could go to Marshall's and buy a cheap suitcase, and if they tear that suitcase apart, you buy another cheap suitcase. But back then, making an investment in luggage was a big investment. These were things that were expensive, and they were expected to last you several years, you know, many trips. And so I think like building a portrait of a target audience like that, where you're basically letting the creatives, and I use this expression, Howard likes it a lot, is to put on the costume of the target audience so that you can feel like them. It's like, okay, I got a little bit of money in my pocket. I'm going to start traveling. I need to buy luggage. It's super expensive. I really want something that has quality and durability. But to your point, Jess, it also speaks to like these people also have already gathered some experiences, and they may have been burned a couple of times. You know, there's nothing worse than having that suitcase come on the conveyor belt at the airport and it's like ripped in half and half your clothes is falling out of it, right? So those are the kinds of things I think that might be in a target audience description for this, right? Like what income, but not just income. Like what does that income mean? It means that we're traveling for the first time. It means we're exploring the world. But we have these concerns. We have this, you know, idea of like, how are people going to treat our stuff? And then again, we're building up to an insight that we talked about earlier, a little bit out of order, of like, yeah, nobody treats your shit the way, you know, you treat it.
Do you think they're
Yeah.
targeting men or women?
Did you say that you thought more men, Ro? Did I make that up?
Yeah, I think I said it didn't, but then I thought maybe it's trying to not target a specific one, but it did feel there's nothing even a little bit feminist about the ad. Especially for that time. So I did sort of say I felt like it was men who were about, I think I said over 25. I think I said 25 and over, who had some kind of, they were in some kind of mid-income job. So you have the money to have a bellboy at 30 or 25 or whatever. And it didn't feel like families either. So that's why I think I said it didn't feel like women either, because it didn't feel, you normally target a family through the mother, and that didn't feel like who they were talking to for this ad. It wasn't to mums.
Did you find that kind of language on the briefs that you worked on, you know, women 18 to 54? Did you see that kind of stuff on the briefs?
Yes, we
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
I ask a question rhetorically in my brief writing workshops. Have you ever met a woman 18 to 54?
Yeah.
There's no such person. You know, the best briefs, I think, and the ones that I use, don't talk to age groups. They don't talk to incomes. They don't talk to actually genders. They talk to behavior. So one of the questions, we didn't ask this as we set this up, but what's the emotion they're going after here with this spot? What emotional button are they pushing?
Care or
What anxiety about their
yeah,
secret?
yeah.
And is that unique to men or women?
No.
No, I don't think so. I mean, maybe men would tough it up and pretend like they don't care, but you know, if it's their stuff, like you said, their stuff is their stuff. So it's not always a question on a brief. What's the emotion? I like to add it to a brief, and I take my brief writing students through an old school technique. Henry, I'm sure, knows about this. It's called a benefit laddering exercise. It's like you find a benefit for the product, and you ask the question, well, why is that important to me as the target? And you come up with an answer. And you say, well, why is that important? And you keep digging deeper and deeper until you get to a core emotion. There are only a handful of emotions out there. And then you land on this emotion, anxiety, right? And then you ask the question, okay, if I told you that the emotional button I want you to put is anxiety, if I told you that before you saw the brief, would it have resonated with you? Most people say, I never would have guessed. But it's believable because, yeah, that's what this is all about. You know, I loved a quote from a brief that was written by Leo Burnett about the same time in the 70s for NyQuil. It was the brief that I think produced that spot. What's the nighttime sneezing, sniffling, coughing, so you can
Stuffy
sleep medicine?
head. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was a target description that simply said cold sufferers. You know what happens when you get a cold. That's sneezing, sniffling, slovenly, snot producing. You just want to curl up in bed and you want, damn it, you want your mummy. You feel like something right out of a Salvador Dali painting. It had nothing to do with gender or age or income. It was just what happens when you get a cold.
Targeting a mindset.
Mm.
So I think in this case, there's definitely nothing overtly feminine in the spot or the execution, but I think that, and I think that it is true of the time. And again, we have to put ourselves in that time and not necessarily in today's time. And you mentioned early on, it could be business travel, right? Which would be a big reason for frequent travel among people. In the early 70s, let's face it, a lot of the people that were doing business travel were men. Things weren't as equal as they are now in terms of those types of careers. I mean, that's why we're proud of my agency. It was founded in 1972, was founded by a woman. And we're proud of it because she was a trailblazer. In 1972, a lot of high school graduate women, former secretaries, didn't start ad agencies, and we're very proud of that. But it's a reality. So within that target, it might have been disproportionately male, but I don't think that anything in the spot necessarily excludes a female from feeling that anxiety. Like a high-powered woman in that time that would travel might relate to the idea of the spot as well, simply because of the mistreatment that we see of the luggage is something that anybody that has a bag that's entrusted to somebody else would not want to see.
Another truth, though, Henry, is that men have historically hated to shop. So do you think a guy would go out looking for luggage? I think his wife or girlfriend or mother would be the one who'd get buy his suits maybe. I know how my dad was. He hated to shop. I saw him buy a pair of pants once, 3 inches too short, and he didn't care.
But he might express a preference to the wife or whoever is in charge of buying
maybe
the luggage.
Right.
So what's the next thing, Howard?
Maybe we can look at what would they think before. What were they thinking? What do they think now before they saw the spot, and what would they think once they've seen the spot?
The audience, you mean, what the audience think?
Yeah. So in terms of a brief, sometimes we have a couple of questions that we refer to as a shift, right? So in a brief, let's say before this commercial was made, if this brief had a shift and it says, there's a question that says, what does the audience think now? And what do we hope for them to think after being exposed to whatever message we come up with? So what do you guys think of a before and after?
I guess now, well, I mean, this is where I know that I thought, damn, that's a good suitcase. That's a really good suitcase. And it's a suitcase that's not going to bust open, when it's coming down the conveyor belt. That's what I'm thinking about. And now you feel like your stuff will be safe in this. And that's all you want for your luggage. You don't need anything else from your suitcase other than, is my stuff going to be in it intact when I get to wherever I'm getting to and I open it again? So I guess now they feel, my stuff's going to be safe in this. It's going to.
I like
So
that.
what
I
is
like
it-
that
what
as
is-
an. I like that as an after.
Yes. So
So
assuming
let-
that, what would you think they'd think before that? Given that, there's kind of an insight built into that.
I guess, does it come back to the anxiety again? Anxious that their stuff will be ruined.
It
in
could.
transit?
So I think this.
I think it's more fundamental.
Yeah, I think this is a really a great discussion point, because if we have an after, that's a damn good suitcase. The before might have been, they're all the same, right? Like maybe it's a parody product, like luggage is luggage. Like, and one of the things I like to, when I use a shift in brief, I like to use language that the consumer might actually use there. So I could see like a focus group participant, they recruited these people to talk about travel and we start talking about luggage, and the jaded woman says, luggage is luggage. And then
Yeah.
what we want them to come out of is, damn, that's a good suitcase, right? Like at the end. So I'm not saying that's necessarily the case. It could be others. It could be Samsonite is way more expensive or premiumly priced than the competition, right? Which is a different, like saying, yeah, Samsonite is super expensive, I'm not going to consider it, to, oh, now I know why it's premium price. It's a better suitcase. So it's not always an obvious thing, but there's a couple of candidates that we have there for possible what they might think before. Now, granted, usually a strategist or the client has done that research and has some idea of what consumers feel about the category and the brands within that category. But as like Howard said, as a pretty known commodity at the time, Samsonite, a household name in luggage, probably there was some sort of pre-perceived perception of the brand that afterwards, after this demo, it kind of makes it feel like it's worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought a connected or an ancillary thought to Henry's luggage is, I never really gave it a second thought of what could happen. I mean, I've always been lucky. My
Out of
luggage came
sight, out of mind.
out of sight, out of mind. It came down the conveyor belt. It was okay. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but it never occurred to me what could possibly happen. And then it's like, whoa, now that I know, it's like, I never thought about that before. I need to do something to protect my belongings, to protect my luggage.
Better to be,
but
better to be safe, right? Could be could be an after, right? Like better to be safe.
Yeah. Would a before be like, I'm not paying more for a suitcase and it's just the same as, the one I can get from wherever. But then after you see it, now you're like, well, actually, that's a good suitcase. I'll pay more for it because it will last.
There's 3 different possible candidates for a mindset before, and I think they all have legitimacy.
Yeah. And it would be up to the brief writer and the client at that point, whatever was the situation. We don't have the benefit of having the files and knowing what they were saying. So I think we have an insight, and I love the insight that we have, the human truth of phrase it how but basically people don't take care of your stuff the way you do.
And I prefer, Henry, your choice of words rather than say insight, because insight kind of makes us all freeze up, like we have to come up with this amazing insight. Your choice of words is find some interesting tidbit about the product, the category, or the humanity of the situation. And that can be, to use your words, Ro, the nugget that you're looking for that can lead you at least to your first thought. So what's a possible single-minded proposition?
Exactly.
Jess had said, I think, they will protect your luggage from anyone and anything.
Yeah, they're durable enough to withstand anything.
Yeah, I think the challenge with a single-minded proposition, as Howard likes to say, is to come up with something that not only works rationally, but that also has a little bit of a zing to it, almost like a headline, almost like that first, headline in a campaign. And so we kind of do like a headline exercise. We teach it, it's like, start, because what you're saying is right. It's rationally right. And obviously we see the commercials, so we don't want to choose something that's too on the nose to what the commercial is, but we want something that has like some zing and pizzazz to it that could have led to some creator saying, you know what, let's grab a suitcase and give it to a gorilla and have him throw it around. And so, I don't know. And I hadn't really thought about it. I hadn't done the headline exercise, but to me, in my mind, I'm thinking about something like, the torture your suitcase faces is untold, or your suitcases faces unknown torture, like this idea of torture that is hidden from view. And now that'll say, well, then how do we make it bring it to view? How do we show people, like, because you could have easily done the demo, the straight demo, right, with the voiceover showing the cabbie with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, throwing it in the trunk, or the baggage handler or the bellboy, but they went something completely different and therefore much more memorable. But I don't know. I felt like the word torture kept coming up, and especially maybe because of the cage, right, where the gorilla is, and that idea of being confined, with the gorilla.
Yeah. Or if not torture, how about monkeying around?
Yeah.
Okay, there's the Pun City. Pun City is ripe opportunity. Yeah. A couple of things came to mind for me. I love the environment of the cage because, Jess, you said earlier on that you like to think outside the box. That phrase gives me the heebie-jeebies because a creative brief is designed to create guardrails. Creatives need guardrails to fight against, and that expands the imagination. So I know what you mean. We all know what you mean by think outside the box, but that's really counter to what great creatives do.
I have a mentor that said that advertising creativity is like tennis. The objective is to get as close to the line without getting over it. So it's really, it's not necessarily about being outside of the box. It's like being on the edge of the box and really pushing that boundary.
So the two lines that came to me were, not all luggage was created equally. And the other one was, stop, it feels so good.
Not convinced on that one. I like the first one.
Yeah.
But I say as a former writer, well, I'm still a writer, but as a former copywriter, brief writers should shoot for that headlining idea, but don't feel like you must create a headline because it's enough pressure. People freeze up on the single-minded proposition as well. They feel there's so much pressure to do a really good single-minded proposition. So don't feel that you have to write a headline, but if you got a great idea, go for it. We want clarity. Creatives want clarity, and that's what we can work with.
I think the last thing maybe we should talk about is tone. And I think that at that time, 50 years ago, humor was definitely common. I mean, humor has always been common in advertising. It breaks through clutter. If you can get a laugh, it's memorable. It gets people talking and makes advertising viral. Back then, viral meant literally at the water cooler the next day at the office and people talking about what they saw on TV the night before. I think nowadays we're a lot more, I think we're a lot more conscious about tone, about being on brand tone and making sure that whatever advertising execution we create for a brand is within the guidelines of that brand's tone. And I think we're a lot more formal about it. But here, obviously, we saw humor, and it was a specific type of humor. It was almost like an over the top, absurd humor. And so I didn't have any expectation of talking about tone with this brief, but I do think that it could be like if we were going to create a follow-up to this, we would want to keep it in the same tone, right? We would want it to be kind of like that because you start training consumers, and I think Byron Sharp has taught us that you start training consumers to recognize the distinctive brand assets of a brand, and therefore associate only one brand with that specific suite of brand assets, of which the tone is a very, very important one. So I don't know. I think absurd. Do you guys have any thoughts on tone?
And you usually get 2, 3, 4 words or phrases to describe tone. So there's kind of a range here of possibilities for the brand.
Maybe tongue in cheek, the way that the narrator's talking.
Yep. There's a dry humor there for sure,
Yeah,
right?
dry,
Like
yeah.
he's speaking very matter of fact. It's interesting now that you mentioned it, because these are things that as you meditate on the commercial, you realize how layered it is. The announcer is giving a very steady, dry read while this incredible violence is happening on the screen with the gorilla throwing.
Yeah, it's not fighting with the image.
but it is contrasting, and so it's creating an overall impression of he feels he's like the announcer's very serene and sound while
Yeah.
all this is happening, and I think that maybe that's giving you the impression of you can feel serene knowing that all this stuff is happening in your suitcase. It's going to be okay. By the way, my favorite touch of the commercial is the second to last frame when the door starts to
Yeah.
close and the briefcase gets stuck in the
Stuck.
door and the gorilla just yanks it in and he like, no, I'm gonna get this thing. I just love that. That's my
I have the privilege, probably the only one of the four of us, to having seen this one live on TV. Probably right up, we're in the middle of a Star Trek episode or something like that, back in 1970.
beat me up, Scotty.
Yeah, or Star Trek rerun, I should say. But in any event, yeah, I think definitely reliability is part of this tone, because that's what the message is. You can count on this. But the tongue in cheek would definitely, I think, I don't know if that was the brand tone, but they certainly it evoked that idea in this spot. Was
Very
this a
nice.
one-off? Was this a one-off, Henry? I can't remember if there was a follow-up to this.
I
don't
think
recall.
I think this thing ran for years, or
Yeah.
iterations of this ran for years. I mean, it became so iconic, and people kind of associated Samsonite with this gorilla. You know, I remember I was that nerd at school that had a briefcase. I had a Samsonite.
So Jess and Ro, you've been great, and this conversation has gone on really well. Did we put you through the ringer? Or did you come out okay? How do you feel?
Yeah, no, it was pretty fun.
It was fun. It was there was lots to think about as well. I feel like you said a few things that I'm going to make note of that.
Yeah, definitely
okay.
calling an insider tidbit from now on. That makes it way less intimidating. I like
Well,
it.
hopefully that's the big lesson here for all our young viewers out there is, this is supposed to be fun.
Yeah.
We got into this business because we didn't want to do real work. And
Right.
so let's have fun with it. And let's all aim to create work that's as memorable and enduring as Samsonite and that spot. Because the truth is, our industry gets a lot of negative heaped on it. But at the end of the day, we're helping people find products that ideally would make their lives better. And I think the people that created this spot in particular felt they were doing right by a brand that was providing something to consumers. So
Yeah.
that's a good ideal to shoot for.
We are delighted that you have chosen our profession to pursue. And Henry and I are grateful that you both could join us for this amazing discussion. And you've kicked off what I hope will be an ongoing series of conversations with students current and recently graduated from Marc Lewis's amazing School of Communication Arts in London. So Ro Kerr and Jess Saunders, thank you for being on the Brief Brothers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's our pleasure. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.